Welcome back to this series on Introduction to Philosophy, the Ancient Philosophy unit. In this part, we're going to be talking about pre-Socratic philosophy. There is a handout that goes along with this, and the handout draws from a book by Kirk, Raven, and Schofield, which is just a classic text called The Pre-Socratic Philosophers, A Critical History with a Selection of Texts, and it's from Cambridge University Press. So I would encourage you to get a copy of that, but you also have several excellent selections in the Reginald Allen book that you should really read over. The handout is very good. You have a copy of it. For those of you who are watching this on the web, I'll see if I can upload a copy of that handout. I'm not going to go through the entire thing. I'll let you do that on your own. But I just want to preface the material on the handout with just some general comments. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that in the ancient world, there's no such thing as a nation. So there's no Greek nation, okay? There's just a series of city-states ringing the Mediterranean, and these are each city-state is its own political entity. So they're constantly at war with each other. Really, they're tied together by language, not by political unity. Another thing that's important to keep in mind is trade. Okay, the trade routes along the Mediterranean allow for this exchange of ideas, and that's what allows for pre-Socratic philosophy to emerge. In fact, we're talking about mostly about the 500s BC, and during this time period, Greece wasn't really yet a major cultural powerhouse. Really, Egypt was the far stronger center of learning at the time, and further east in Babylonia. So the Greeks are really just beginning to emerge as cultural leaders, or what we might call scientific leaders. Of course, the term science is also relatively recent, so they didn't call it science. They would have called it perhaps natural philosophy. How do we even know what these guys were thinking about or talking about, these pre-Socratic philosophers? Well, through a tradition known as doxography. Doxography was a series of ancient editorial traditions. One type of doxographical writing would be what today we might call an edited volume. So they might have a book called On the Heavens, and it would collect what all the various philosophers said about astronomy. There was another type of doxographical writing, which were the accounts of philosophical successions. So it might say, all right, this is Thales of Miletus, his student was Anaximander, his student was Anaximenes, and then it would give an overview of the thoughts of these various different thinkers. Another way that we know about them is through actual fragments. Very few complete books exist from this pre-Socratic period, but there might be a few words on a small scrap of parchment or papyrus, right? Just a few words, and scholars who are way smarter than me are able to put these fragments together and surmise what book they may have come from, and what the context behind that fragment might be. Another way is through quotations. A lot of the quotations come from Aristotle. He quoted extensively from the pre-Socratic philosophers. Later Christian thinkers also quoted extensively from the pre-Socratic philosophers. And I'm just going to pause right there, and I'm going to skip over a lot of this, and because it is on the handout, and I would encourage you to pause the recording here, make sure you have read over the handout and read over the chapters in the Reginald Allen book. And just for fun, I have here some ancient artifacts for you. And I want you to get out a piece of paper and see if you can write down what these objects are. Okay, everybody got it? Any guesses? This one here, what do you think that is? Well, it turns out it's a lamp. It's sitting on its side. It has a palm frond detail on it. You would fill it up with oil and the wick would come out here. Any guesses about this one? These are actually called bullae, and like a papal bull. These were seals that were applied to scrolls, and the impression would be from a ring that would belong to the owner, and so you could tell whose scroll it was. Now the cool thing about these is that they were made out of wax, but this is not wax that you see. The whatever library these scrolls were in burned down, and the intensity of the fire was such that it left the impression in the surrounding clay. I believe that's how this works. I don't know, maybe some archaeologists will write in and tell me that I'm entirely wrong about that, but I believe it's the impression left in the surrounding soil that makes for these surviving artifacts, because the clay itself would have just, burnt up. What about this one? What do you think it is? Is it a hairpin? Is it a safety pin? Well, yeah, it's kind of a safety pin. This was called a fibula. It's a pin that you would put on your toga to hold it together right here. This one is, I don't know, looks kind of like a jewelry box, right? It's actually a larnax, which is a funerary vessel. And this one is made out of gold, so it would have been for a very wealthy person. It would have contained either ashes or bones. I don't think you didn't put the entire corpse in there. And this one, of course, is a key. This is a Roman key. I don't know. Looks like it would have been kind of easy to pick the lock, but anyway, the only reason I show you these artifacts, and you guys can find some really awesome material about archaeology on the web, but I just want to underscore that this is a completely different world than the world that we live in now. And like we were saying last time about history, we want to avoid the assumption that this world is pretty much like ours, but with togas. Okay, we don't want to think it's too similar, but we also don't want to think it's too different. In some ways, they did have similar concerns that we do today. So just keep in mind that tension between sameness and difference. That these people were not entirely different from us, nor were they entirely the same. Okay, so we're going on to a dialogue called the Euthyphro. This slide is based on an in-class exercise, but take out a piece of paper and ask yourself, what does it mean for an action to be morally good? And how do you know if that action is morally good? So you can go ahead and pause the recording and think about that question. And while you're at it, go ahead and turn in your book to the Euthyphro. If you're using the Allen book, it's on page 57, but really any translation of the Euthyphro will do. And we'll go ahead and move on. So Socrates is going to court, and he meets this young man named Euthyphro. And it turns out that Euthyphro is on his way to court as well. So as we're going through the dialogue, be on the lookout for these definitions and Socrates' refutations of the definitions. So you might just want to keep a piece of paper on hand, and as we come to each one, write it down for yourself. I'm not going to fill it in here on the screen for you. Okay. So Euthyphro has been called into court. Now, the way that the Athenian court system worked, if you wanted to take someone to court, you had to charge them yourself. So you had to act as the prosecutor, basically. And they didn't really have a police force like we have today. They did have a like a watch, but it wasn't for looking for criminals. It was for looking for perhaps an invading army. So if you wanted to arrest someone, you had to kind of gather up your friends and go arrest the person. So anyway, Euthyphro is on his way to court, and he's charging his own father with murder. And it turns out that Euthyphro's father had two slaves. One slave had killed the other slave, and Euthyphro's father had the slave who killed the other slave tied up and thrown into a ditch. And then it happened that the other slave also died. So Euthyphro is charging his own father with murder. Now this is a traditional society. There was a lot of respect for the father, and this would have been kind of scandalous, right? Putting your own father, even today this would be scandalous, putting your own father on trial for murder. So the question centers around what is piety, sometimes it's translated, or what does it mean for something to be right? What does it mean for something to be good? So on page 59, or if you have another edition, the marginal notation there will be 4E. It says, but in the name of Zeus, Euthyphro, do you think you yourself know so accurately how matters stand respecting divine law, and things holy and unholy, with the facts as you declare you can prosecute your own father without fear that it is you, on the contrary, who are doing an unholy thing? And Euthyphro, he's a little bit cocky, he's a little bit arrogant, and he says, I would not be much use, Socrates, nor would Euthyphro differ in any way from the majority of men if I did not know all such things as this with strict accuracy. So not only does he know, but he knows with strict accuracy. This is in the Allen book. So Socrates, this is what typical I think this dialogue is great because it shows you how Socrates works when he's doing his philosophy. So he usually asks for a definition, and that's what he does. He says, what sort of thing do you say the pious and the impious are? With respect to murder and other things as well. And Euthyphro says that justice is defined as a dictate of divine law. So this is an early example of what is called divine command theory, that an act is just because God says it is. Okay. And Socrates, there's a lot of back and forth here, but Socrates says, try to answer more clearly the question I just asked. I asked you what the holy is, and you said, well, what you are doing is holy, prosecuting your own father for murder. But Socrates says, I asked you what characteristic by itself makes holy things holy. This is at 6E. So moving along, we get the first definition. Euthyphro says, what is dear to the gods is holy, and what is not dear to them is unholy. So we have our first definition, whatever is dear to the gods. Socrates there's more back and forth. Socrates is going to say, but what is that disagreement about which causes enmity and anger, my friend? Look at it this way. If you and I disagreed about a question of number, about which of two sums is greater, would our disagreement cause us to become angry with each other and make us enemies? Or would we take to counting in a case like that and quickly settle our dispute? So if we had I don't know, 5 some pens, you know, some highlighters. We could count them, and we could resolve our difference by counting. But it's not the same with ethical questions. We can't just get out a calculator and resolve our differences. So this is known as the fact-value distinction in philosophy, and it traces its way back to this dialogue. Okay, so there's some times when we can simply count and resolve our differences, and there's other times when we can't simply count and resolve our differences. The conversation goes on. Of course, the Greeks believed in many different gods and goddesses, and oftentimes those gods and goddesses fought with each other. It is very much like a soap opera. And so Socrates presses Euthyphro on this. Then the same things, it seems, are both hated by the gods and loved by the gods. If the gods disagree, then it seems that the gods will hate some things and love other things. Okay, and you know, if you're a monotheist, you know, you might think you've already got the answer because there's only one God, right? But note that even in monotheistic texts, there seem to be contradictory injunctions in Scripture, so that doesn't really get around the problem. All right, there's a little interlude here that I'm going to skip over, and in the Allen text, it's on page 65, or it's at 9e. What usually happens in these dialogues is that the definition gets tweaked, the definition gets revised. So Euthyphro is going to revise his definition, and he says, I would certainly say that the holy is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is unholy. Okay, so now Euthyphro, oh, well, now I've got it, right? But Socrates keeps pressing, keeps needling, right? And he says, consider, is the holy loved by the gods because it is holy? Or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? That is, do the gods like it because it's good? Or is it good because the gods like it? And it turns out that, you know, Euthyphro doesn't really know why. Is it good because it's loved by the gods, or is it loved by the gods because it's good? And it turns out to go around in a circle. Do you see how that goes around in a circle? The conversation does go on a little bit more, but I mean, we've already really kind of seen how Euthyphro is caught in a trap, that he doesn't really know the answer, but he's going to keep trying. And the third definition, he says that the just, or the holy, or the good, or the pious is ministering to the gods. Ministering to the gods. Okay, you know, worshiping the gods and so forth, giving the gods offerings. Today we might say praying to the gods or whatever. Praying to God, whatever. Socrates says, though, now does holiness, which is a kind of ministering, benefit the gods? Does it improve them? Would you really agree that when you do something holy, you are making something better? And Euthyphro says, well, no, of course not. How can you improve the gods? How can you improve God? You can improve God, right? And he goes on to many different examples, house builders and farmers and so forth. But it doesn't seem to be the case with sacrifice to the gods. It doesn't produce anything, right? And what do the gods produce? Well, we don't really know. So we get another revision where Euthyphro says that the holy or the pious or the good is an act of prayer and sacrifice, the knowledge of how to pray and sacrifice. And Socrates says, well, what does that mean then? Does that mean that holiness or piety is a kind of business transaction between gods and men, as he says at 14e? Is this like a tit for a tat? I give God an offering, God gives me a new car or something like that. It seems kind of crass, right? It seems kind of course, transactional. It seems kind of ugly, right? So you'll see very quickly that we arrive right back at the same place. Euthyphro says, but Socrates, do you think the gods benefit from the things they receive from us? Why, Euthyphro, whatever could these gifts of ours to the gods then be? Euthyphro says, what do you suppose other than praise and honor, and as I have just said, things which are acceptable? Then the holy is what is acceptable, Euthyphro, and not what is beneficial or loved by the gods. I certainly think that it is loved by the gods beyond all other things. And Socrates says, then on the contrary, the holy is what is loved by the gods. And we're right back to the same question. Is it good because the gods love it? Or do the gods love it because it's good? And then Euthyphro gets angry, and he storms off, and he goes on his way to court. So this is a very frequent reaction to Socrates, right? And as we're going to see, it gets him into a lot of trouble. So we're gonna stop there. Next, we're going to be looking at the apology, which is Socrates' defense of himself in court.